continue in verse 25. Then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And from there he went out and built up Peniel. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their lord Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. And after seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel and the other in Dan. And this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. The word of God for the people of God.
Praise God.
Let's pray. Oh God, this morning as we explore this story, we ask that you would help us to hear you speaking to us today, that we might learn from the mistakes of Israel, mistakes that are lived out over and over again in human history. Help us to declare you as our King. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So I am a fan of the show and the books, the Game of Thrones series. And if you watch the show, maybe you were a little disappointed in the ending, kind of like I was. But I still love the show, and I love the books. And any kind of fantasy I tend to like. There's some dragons in there. I'm all about it. But one of the things that I particularly appreciated about the series Game of Thrones was that it didn't shy away from the messy and ugly side of political striving. In fact, that was the main thing that moved the series forward. Because in this story, there's the story of the 7 kingdoms. And they had only recently been united under the king Robert Baratheon. And he was a bit of a lecherous kind of guy. But he was a strong king, and he was able to unite and rule over all of the 7 kingdoms. But then he dies. We learn it's not an accident that he dies. But his son, Joffrey Baratheon, comes to be king. And all I can say about Joffrey in this series is he is a piece of work. We learn very quickly in the very first book of the series the kind of guy that he is. He's the kind of guy who wants to be able to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, however he wants. And he wants everybody to recognize his absolute authority. And there's one moment, a real turning point in the first book, where the person who is the hand of the king, who's an honorable and upstanding guy, he is put on trial, and Joffrey has the opportunity to grant mercy, to show to the kingdom that he is in fact a merciful king, and he says he's going to do that. But in the moment, he changes his mind and has Ned Stark, this beloved character, put to death. That reveals the kind of king that this Joffrey Baratheon is. Well, when I think about the story of Game of Thrones and what makes it such a compelling story, we could probably just change a few names and find ourselves in 1 Kings. And the story that we hear today of Rehoboam and Jeroboam and the fall of the united monarchy. As I said last week, we looked at the story of King David and about how he became king. And so just to remember, prior to David was King Saul, and King Saul was the first anointed king. Israel, all of the tribes of Israel, had decided that they wanted to have a king. Up until that point, they'd been ruled under these sort of charismatic tribal leaders known as judges. But they said, you know, we look at the nations around us and we see kings, and we want a king like everybody else. And we heard that warning that God said, all right, Israel, I will give you a king, but you are going to regret the day that you asked for a king, when you decided you wanted an earthly ruler above me as your ruler. So the monarchy comes into existence under King Saul, and it's expanded and solidified by King David. And then when David dies, his son Solomon becomes the king. And Solomon continues in his father's footsteps. He continues to make political allies and to amass wealth and power. Solomon was really, really good at making political alliances with those around him. And you want to know how he did it? He did it by marrying women from those tribes, from those nations. And he had like hundreds of wives and hundreds of concubines. And so they were a symbol of how much power he had gained. Because I think it's fair to say that pretty much every single marriage contract that was arranged had some kind of political reason, some kind of political alliance or power behind it. And so Solomon gained power that way. He also gained power, and we get a glimpse of this in today's passage, by placing a heavy yoke upon his people, which probably meant a couple of things. The first one that's named here in this particular passage is forced labor. King Solomon was pretty prolific in having these building projects. He put his wealth into play. So he had all of these various building projects, of course one of the most significant ones being the temple in Jerusalem, but they were built on the backs of forced labor, often his own people, and often in particular people from the 10 northern tribes. They were the poorer of the tribes. The 2 southern tribes in Judah, they were the wealthier people. But the 10 northern tribes suffered under the yoke of forced labor. And not only that, one of the ways that a king in this day and time would gain wealth was through taxation. You know, we like to complain that taxes are bad today. They're like a drop in the bucket compared to what Solomon would have done. Solomon's taxation of his people was an oppressive yoke. And so he got richer as his people suffered more and more. Now we find all of this troubling, because Solomon was named as this wise king of the Bible. But what we see is throughout Solomon's reign, he becomes less and less wise in the ways of God and more concerned with his own power, his own authority. One of the other things that happens under King Solomon's reign is, as he has married all of these women from many different neighboring tribes and nations, is that when they come to live at Solomon's court, they bring with them the worship of their tribal or national gods. And over time, Solomon just kind of allowed this to be. And so he became extremely lax in things pertaining to the worship of Yahweh, of the people of Israel. And this was seen in the eyes of God as sin. And in fact, there was a prophet that was named in the text, named Ahijah the Shilonite. Ahijah begins prophesying that Solomon's reign, this line of David, is not going to last. Why? Because of what Solomon has allowed to happen in his midst and in his reign as king. And so Jeroboam, who was a servant of King Solomon, starts to have these ideas in his head that, you know, the state of this kingdom maybe isn't going to last too much longer. Maybe I can become a ruler of the 10 northern tribes. Of course, Solomon kind of finds out about Jeroboam's secret desires, and Jeroboam has to flee to Egypt to save his own life. Well, we now arrive at the time of Solomon's death. And his son Rehoboam is the heir apparent. He's the one who's about to ascend the throne, and all of the tribes of Israel have gathered around. And Jeroboam, hearing about Solomon's death, doesn't fear for his life anymore, and so he comes back to represent the 10 tribes, the northern tribes of Israel, to come to Rehoboam and say, look, your father's yoke was heavy upon these people with his taxation, with his forced labor. So let me tell you what, Rehoboam, if you can go in a different direction than your father went, if you can lighten that yoke, we will give you our loyalty. We will continue to be a part of this kingdom in the line of David. So Rehoboam says, all right, give me a few days, and let me talk to some people about this. And so Jeroboam goes away for 3 days. Rehoboam first goes to the elders that served his father Solomon. Now, given their counsel, I have to think that they kind of saw the way that Solomon had taken things, and they knew it was not a good direction to continue in. And so they counsel Rehoboam, hey, do what Jeroboam says. Lighten your yoke on the northern tribes so that you can remain king over them. And Rehoboam is not into that answer. He doesn't want to be seen as a softie. And so he dismisses them and says, don't like that answer. He calls his friends to him, the ones who were his age, who had grown up in the sort of opulence of the court, who had never known oppression, who had always been sort of privileged. He says, what should I tell them? And they say, all right, Rehoboam, don't be soft. In fact, you need to bring down the hammer harder on these people. They think they can command you and tell you what you need to do as king. You should tell them, oh, you thought my father's yoke was heavy? Wait until you see what I do to you. Now that's the answer that Rehoboam likes, because he thinks that that makes him look strong and mighty and authoritative. He thinks it makes him look like a real man. And so Rehoboam, after the 3 days, calls Jeroboam and all the tribes back to him, and he tells them exactly what his friend says. You thought my father's yoke was bad, I'm about to bring down the hammer on you all. So Jeroboam and the 10 tribes, basically they say, all right, Rehoboam, you had the chance to win our loyalty. There is no way in the world we will serve you now. And so Jeroboam and the 10 northern tribes, they leave. They say, we will not recognize you as king. And so they go up north to Shechem, and they name Jeroboam as their king, just as that prophet under Solomon's rule had said. Now, things continue to get worse all around, because now that there's this divided monarchy, there's this problem about worship. Because see, Rehoboam is the king of Judah, which means he is the king who presides, rules over Jerusalem. And if he is the king that rules over Jerusalem, he is also the king who has control over the temple. And so Jeroboam realizes that this could be a real problem if the people of the 10 northern tribes want to go down and worship at the temple. Now, while I believe that Jeroboam's intentions in the beginning may have been that he wanted to see and rule over an Israel that wasn't suffering under the yoke of oppression, that wasn't being tempted by the worship of false gods, he falls into the same pitfalls that Rehoboam does when it comes to worship of God. Because Jeroboam says, well, I can't have my people going down there. They will give their allegiance back to Rehoboam if they go down to Jerusalem. So I got to keep them up here and separate. So what am I going to do? I'm going to build altars or shrines where they can worship. And did you notice what kind of shrine it was? He built 2, and they were golden calves. Does that ring a bell? That story back in Exodus when Moses is leading his people, and Moses is up on the mountain receiving the 10 commandments, and down below the people are getting impatient. And Aaron says, here, throw out your gold together, and we'll create this golden calf, and this shall be your object of worship. Well, Jeroboam does the exact same thing because he wants to provide a place for his people to worship that doesn't involve them having to go down into King Rehoboam's territory. And here we see this separation, we see this conflict, and we see both kingdoms now. The kingdom of Judah under Rehoboam and the kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam. Both failing to worship the God of Israel as their king. I'm telling you, there is so much drama in these pages that I'm finding it hard to put down. I'm finding it hard to look away from the messy reality and consequences that come from Israel saying, we want our own king so that we can be like the nations. Well, that is exactly what happens to them. They start to look exactly like the other nations. There's divisions, there's quarrels, there's oppression, there's forced labor and slavery, all under the headship of an earthly king, or now 2. This is what happens when God's people put their trust in an earthly leader, in an earthly ruler. And even if that earthly ruler starts out with the best intentions, ultimately the power that they have leads them to elevate themselves rather than the God of Israel. We live in a world, in a time today where, in our society, we don't have kings. We don't live in this kind of tribal society. This is not our reality. And yet, when you hear this story, do you not hear God's commentary on our world today? It is so tempting as people to put our trust or our hope in earthly people or earthly institutions, to declare that this party or this leader is somehow the answer to what we need. I'm sure that we all have fallen into that at some point or another. And it is so hard not to. But when we do, we repeat the same mistakes that Israel made thousands of years ago, when they elevated a worldly ruler above God. we're super close to Advent. And Advent, the first Sunday in Advent, is the first Sunday of the new year. But that means that the last Sunday of the year is also quickly approaching. And that Sunday is called Christ the King Sunday. Christ the King Sunday. It's not an accident that Christ the King Sunday falls on the very last Sunday of the year. Because as we move to Advent and we turn back to the beginning, to the promise coming, to the incarnation of Jesus Christ in a tiny baby, and we move through the year to Lent as Jesus moves towards the cross, and then Easter, the story of the resurrection, the end of the year, we recognized Christ as King. Christ as the one true ruler. Christ as the one who rules the kingdom of which we are citizens. And who is this king? Does he look like these other kings? Does he look like one who is concerned with power for himself or amassing wealth and authority over armies and conquest? Is he the kind of king who squeezes the most vulnerable of his subjects? No. We know that Christ the King is unlike any king that we find in these pages. And he is unlike any ruler, any authority that we find in our world today. The story, the narratives that we find in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, they're really messy stories. And I can't neatly tie them up. All I can do is wrestle with them and ask for God to speak to me and show me what he has to say through them today. And so I invite you to ponder and to meditate on the story of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and to ask yourselves along with me, what does it mean to declare Christ and Christ alone as our King?